Wonderful, wonderful. I have looked forward to this interview.
Yes, me too. I thank you so much for being so willing and taking your time.
My pleasure. As you know, the KH is the Khe, a sound we don't have in U.S.
Right, right.
Zikru'llah Khadem.
Zikru'llah. Sometimes we see it with a Z, and sometimes I also see it with a D.
Yeah, sometimes with a DH, sometimes with a Z.
Okay.
I think that Z has been used more often.
Right.
Although H is also correct.
Yes.
So I use Z.
You use
And
Z.
in his signatures, he always used Z, which means mention of God.
And Jena, what does that mean in English?
I think it comes maybe from Russian, and it refers to woman. My mother was very much westernized in her time, and so they didn't want to choose a typical Persian name. And she came upon this name. I guess she liked it, and she gave me the name, and I spell it with one N.
Maybe we could start with some early memories. You were born in Iran, that's right?
Yes, I was born in Tehran, Iran. Let's forget the year for the time.
And when you were born, your father was not yet appointed hand of the cause, is that right?
He was not.
Tell me something about growing up in Iran as a Baha'i.
It's been very, very oppressive environment. From time to time, persecution started. And once in a while, they would stop in the interim, but then always back to persecution of Baha'is and the name-calling and the repression. That has been the pattern ever since I can remember, from my childhood to the time I left Iran for higher education in the United States. And after that, it continued with greater vehemence against the Baha'is in Iran. And I remember being in settings of other children and being ridiculed. I remember being in Iranian school systems and being publicly ridiculed by the teacher and by the students. So that was the norm. From time to time on the pulpit, the mullahs, the clergy would go and they would defame the Baha'is. And at those times, the zeal against the Baha'is, the animosity would grow to a crescendo. So that's what I remember from my childhood and teenage years in Iran.
And your memories of your father as you were growing up. I've heard people say his kindness was remarkable.
Well, the qualities in him was his devotion. I mean, his staunchness in the covenant, his devotion to the central figures of the Baha'i Faith, and his devotion to the beloved guardian. This was the way he was raised from childhood. They lived in a place, in an enclave in Tehran called Hayat Bab, where many other Baha'is lived. And their home was the center for any traveling Baha'i teacher who would come into town. The likes of Nayer and Sina. Probably know these two individuals, very, very devoted Baha'is. And Naim, the noted poet. They would all come to my grandparents' home. And there in that enclave, there were those uplifting meetings of which I heard later on. And when I think of that, to this day, it impassions. They would go to the basement, something like the cellar of the house, and by light of a single candle, it was all in secrecy. The letters and messages which were received from Abdul Baha at that time were being read and discussed. And just imagine that a bunch of devoted Baha'is set on fire with their passion, sitting around the candle and reading those messages. Then that would set them aflame. It was just like that essence of spirituality that was among them. Because if discovered, they could have been imprisoned and killed. So it was all in secrecy in their own home with some of the notable Baha'is as they came into town and stayed with them and as they left. And this was his childhood, reared by his father and mother and his grandmother, for whom he had, his grandmother was called Bibi Jan, for whom he had a lot of love and devotion because she participated in raising him. And she was one of those lionesses of the faith. She and one other woman, devoted Baha'i, saw it their duty to go and retrieve the martyred bodies, the dead bodies of the martyrs for proper burial. Because there was martyrdom at that time to a great extent. And as these were martyred, they were thrown down with a lot of disrespect to mutilate them. So she and one other woman would go to the side, fall on these dead bodies and say, "This is my brother, this is my brother."
Oh, that's how they
Retrieve
did it.
these bodies for proper burial. So this was the kind of environment he was raised. His father was from Kashan, and his grandfather was the one who first became a Baha'i. So I'm a fourth generation Baha'i. There was a sheikh of Kashan who brought the faith to their village, and there persecution started for the Baha'is. So his grandfather left Kashan for Iran, and then his father, Nasrullah, served Abdul Baha for 4 years when Abdul Baha was in the cave of Elijah. You remember that story?
Oh, yes.
Abdul Baha. So that was his background. And I suppose all of that went into the extent of passion which he felt. But very much noteworthy in all of this about my father is that when beloved Shoghi Effendi was then appointed as the guardian of the faith, and that was, a passing of Abdul Baha was in 1921, shortly after, it was in 1925, I believe, that my father wrote a message. In Persian we say arize. I don't know what to say that in English. Arize is a letter that's written from one who is much lower to one who was much higher.
Ah.
He wrote an arize to beloved guardian, pledging his devotion and love for him. And then he received a response from Shoghi Effendi, which actually impassioned that flame to an extent that he could no longer contain himself. And so he wanted to go to the presence of Shoghi Effendi, and he asked for permission to go. The permission was not coming. So what he did is he went to one of the notable Baha'is in Tehran, Haj Amin, and he said, please, you write a letter to Shoghi Effendi and place a plea that I should receive permission to go to his presence. And this Haj Amin, knowing the state of my father's state, thinking that this young man is so irrational, he wrote a letter. And then at the end, he added a postscript. If you permit him to come, fine. But if you don't, so much the better.
Very diplomatic.
Diplomatic. He didn't know what to do with him because it just could not be contained. The response did not come. He could no longer wait. And then he said, well, maybe if I go to Iraq, if I go to Baghdad, need to be closer to my destination.
Yes.
I'll wait there and I'll go there. So he went to Baghdad and no response had come. Then he said, well, maybe I will just get on this in a taxi, what were they called? It was like a bus
Yes.
taxi. Maybe I'll just get on that and go anyway. And so he did. And he did. And on his way, he used to tell us that he would constantly say, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? To the point that the other passengers were fed up with him. And so when finally the bus arrived in Haifa next to the house of Abdul Baha, he is where he wants to be. But all of a sudden, the thought dawns on him, I have come here and I have no permission. He didn't know what to do. So when he gets out of this, let's call it taxi, the other passengers, fellow passengers, are just so happy to be rid of him. But Dr. Esliman from the Western Pilgrim House, overseeing, realizes that someone has gotten off this cab and now is heading toward the house of Abdul Baha. So he comes down and greets him, and my father shares his issue, his problem with him. So anyway, they go and knock on the door of the house of Abdul Baha, where Shoghi Effendi lived, and as the door opens, the beloved guardian father hands him the permission.
Oh.
This permission was just going to be mailed out.
Oh my gosh. He was just in time.
Yeah. So after that, of course, the rest of it is history, and his passion grew every day. And when he married my mother, we were surrounded with that. He could not be contained. Our house was the place where many Baha'is came. His special attention went to the Baha'is who lived in south of Tehran. These were the Baha'is who you seldom saw in the meetings. They had their own gatherings and they had special needs. But his attention went to a great extent to these Baha'is. Then he was on the NSA of Iran for many years. On the centenary of the Declaration of the Bab, which would have been 1944, he had a very special assignment given by the beloved guardian to take the Loh Qarm. It was a tablet that was for that centenary to to take it to Shiraz so it could be chanted at the gathering.
At the gathering.
Shiraz.
Oh.
And so that was very close to the war years.
How did things change in your family and for you when he was appointed? He had to do a lot more traveling, is that right?
Yes, before he was appointed, he traveled throughout Iran. But after he was appointed, his assignment, he traveled a lot outside Iran. And that's why the beloved guardian called him itinerant hand of God. He traveled outside Iran to all continents. I can't begin to tell you how many places, to many, many countries,
Yes.
under very difficult conditions, sometimes with the two-engine planes to carry on the assignments that were given by him, by Shoghi Effendi. Most of these assignments actually came after his appointment in 1952
Right.
as the second contingent of Hands of the Cause in Iran. It was an experience to behold. I cannot very well, I have no recollection of that, but my mother says that she was present when a cablegram came in, pointing him as the Hand of the Cause. He was stupefied. He could not believe it. He said, no, this is a hoax. I cannot be Hand of the Cause. I'm not Hand of the Cause. No way. Let's go to Mr Khadem and tell him that people are sending such messages.
Oh, wow.
And so first he went to his mother to tell her that I received. She said, no, this must be real. Because in a tablet many years ago, there was some kind of premonition about this. Anyway, so then they went to Mr Khadem, the secretary of the NSA of Iran, to verify whether this was a real, this was actually from beloved guardian or a hoax. After that, his life changed.
Yes.
And I'm not saying in terms of his devotion. His devotion remained at a very high level from the very beginning to the end of his life. But in terms of his assignment, he traveled internationally extensively.
How did this affect the family? Did you have brothers and sisters? How did the family keep together, and how did you keep in touch with him?
Well, when he traveled, we had sufficient care. At times my mother was with us, and at times she traveled with him. My two grandmothers, Mrs. Javid and also Mrs. Khadem, Razia Khanum Khadem, would take on the responsibility. And at that time, my father had maids, cooks, and chauffeurs and servants. He was quite prosperous. So these individuals, these family members, simply provided supervision, not the labor, not the hard labor.
Yes.
Although that supervision was hard by itself also. But as a child, what I remember foremost, and do to this day, is his passion.
Yes.
I have not known anyone I have observed. Of course, I could not know anyone else as well as I do my father. So I'm not saying he was unique in that fashion. But for me, he was exemplary.
Do you have any memories of favorite songs or quotations that your father would like to sing or to use?
Well, my memories are different levels. First of all, my father, when he was in the presence of the beloved guardian, mentioned that the youth should memorize. And he mentioned, in fact, memorization of the Book of Certitude. So when my father came back from pilgrimage, he set out to memorize the entire Book of Iran in the original language, the entire book, as well as many other tablets. So I don't know, in this video they talk about his carrying the original Book of Iran to the World Center, and that is true. As you know, the Book of Iran was in response to one of the uncles of the Bab had gone to the presence of Baha'u'llah and had difficulty to accept the Bab, his nephew, as the promised one. And so the Baha'u'llah tells him, go and come back tomorrow with your question. So the next day he goes to the presence of Baha'u'llah and with his question. And in the course of 48 hours, Baha'u'llah answers the question of the uncle of the Bab. 48 hours. And all of this was written, transcribed, recorded by Abdul Baha, and Baha'u'llah in the margin adds his notations.
Wow.
So this book was in the family of the Bab, the Afnan. You know, the Afnan is the title of family of the Bab.
Yes.
And so Fatima Khanum Afnan, one of the descendants of this family, finds this book in their possession. So he contacts Mr. Samandari and one other hand of the cause that he has found this book in his possession. So the message goes to Shoghi Effendi that the original book has been found by one of the descendants of the Bab. And they set out, not Shoghi Effendi, but these wonderful individuals who know of its existence, they set out to ask Fatima Khanum for the book. She did not want to give the book. And I understand that. Don't you? Yes. She did not want to give up the book. And Shoghi Effendi very graciously says, you should not force her. This really, do not force her. Do not put her under pressure. But some years after, father's wish and prayer had been that he would be entrusted with carrying that book, hand carrying that book to the World Center.
Wow.
But he spoke of this wish to no one. And then on one of his pilgrimages to the presence of Shoghi Effendi cabled and this book through Khadem. And so this book on this pilgrimage, when my older brother was also going on the same pilgrimage in the same plane, he relates that throughout that ride, my father constantly came out. The verses of Iran poured from him, from his memory. And when they arrived in Haifa and he offers the book to Shoghi Effendi says something to the effect of this unique present. You asked about what would he say? He would just quote from Iran. But he also would quote from Qayyum al-Asma. Very moment, his chant in the Arabic from Qayyum al-Asma, which was the commentary
on the Surah of Joseph, yes.
Yes, just reverberate in my mind. He had a lot of memorization. And in the Western world, what he would often in his talk say is, "Oh God, increase my astonishment in thee." I think this is also in Seven Values.
Yes.
God, increase my astonishment in thee.
Indeed.
When he reached a point which was unspeakable for him, unfathomable, in those mystical realms, he would say, "Oh God, increase my astonishment in thee."
What about when you came to the United States? Tell us about that.
Yes, I came to United States after 11th grade high school, and that high school was in the American school, which is now called Iran Zamir. It was a Presbyterian missionary school to pursue higher education. And my parents came in 1960 when he was assigned to North America by hands of the gods.
Okay, what were your impressions as a young woman coming to this country?
To this country, well, my expectation was very high. All that had been said and fantasized about America. And I found it very accepting. I found the American Baha'is close to the college where I went to Worcester College, Worcester in Ohio, first few years. The reason being that Worcester College is Presbyterian college, and the high school I went to was a Presbyterian missionary school, and they recommended Worcester College. And it was a solid, very solid, small college. I was pleased with that. But it was amazing the love and attention that the Baha'is nearby Worcester in Cleveland, that's quite a few hours away from Worcester, paid to me. And also my brother, who went to a different college. They would come weekends to visit us with love and food and books and invite us to meetings. It was just an amazing thing. And I remember quite a few of those Baha'is who are still with us. That was my impression of America, and that helped a lot because later on I had impressions of America and I saw also the other aspects which puzzled me much. The racial issue, the Native American, the African American, injustices that have been done to these two precious sectors of society. And then I began to really see what also needs to be done I think perhaps the situation now has somewhat improved, but still there is a lot of work to be done. So those are my impressions of America. Certainly it's a land of opportunity for learning, a land of freedom, especially after leaving Iran with that repression where there was no freedom of belief. Those were my impressions of America and still are. They still remain as such.
And so tell us a little bit about how you decided to study what you eventually ended up studying at university.
Yes, I have always been interested in science, knowing how things work. So after the bachelor's degree, then for a couple of years we went to Canada because my husband applied for a fellowship. He's a surgeon.
Okay.
Applied for fellowship to Canada, and that ended up being Winnipeg, Canada. Extremely cold.
Very cold.
After a few years in Canada, we came back to the United States. Then at that time, I wanted to continue my education. I've always been interested in science, and so I applied to Northwestern University, which had a nice science faculty, in particular in biological sciences. My interest was finding out how cells and molecules work. So that's where I entered for my graduate studies. And I selected Northwestern because it was not too far away from the city where my husband had started a surgical practice. But then I realized soon after that the biological sciences I had applied to was going to be exactly in my area of interest, because right around those times, not right on, sometime before that, the findings in molecular biology, the findings of the structure of the DNA, the genetic material, had been disclosed with Watson and Crick, and so it had made a great impact in the field. So the biological sciences I wanted to study, in fact, had been revolutionized. What had became my passion, molecular level. No longer the study of zoology or botany, all of which are very important, but that had never been my interest. But actually delving into the structure of cells and molecules and into molecular genetics. And after that, I went for postdoctoral fellowship in also very close by to in Chicago, and then became a faculty at Rush Medical College. And relatively in recent times, I have been retired, so that I decided to do that so that I can devote some years to those areas that really impassion me, such as writing books, writing articles, wondering whether I can sufficiently complete all of the projects underway.
While he was still alive, your father, he was supportive of your field, your work in the sciences?
Very much. He was very much supportive of what I was doing. Yeah. In his wallet, after he passed away, I actually found clippings of newspapers where they had mentioned that I was giving a presentation or given or whatever. So I knew it meant a lot, much more than I had realized.
I want to talk just a little bit about the book. You mentioned that some of the inspiration that you got to do this book was from your father, and I want to find out what the link is there.
Okay, how should I put it? The inspiration came because from childhood,
yes,
the growth of the Baha'i Faith was central to our life. It was a subject that was always discussed. It was ingrained in us that the growth of Baha'i Faith is very important, and whatever we do and whatever we say, however we carry this out, will be very important in the growth of the Baha'i Faith. I soon came to the realization on my own that a whole new premise, let's say theory, but actually more premise of religion is needed, because I went to missionary school, as I mentioned to you, which was just dominated by a Christian missionary scene in a country which was dominated by the Shia, and confronted with these two, each of which was actually working against the other. I asked myself, would it not be wonderful to have a unified theory, premise of religion that would make sense of all of these? Now, these thoughts were actually in early stages of in 4th or 5th or 6th grade. I was overwhelmed with this. And then suddenly I realized, oh gosh, such a unified premise is here among us. It's the Baha'i paradigm of oneness of religion and progressive revelation. And therefore, if it is among us, and if that is the solution, why is it that we are not growing at a rate that we should be growing? However, as a child, I was very impatient.
Just like your father.
It was not that we were not growing. In fact, every day messages were coming in that the Baha'i Faith had penetrated yet one territory, yet one island, and yet it seemed insufficient, because as a child, I felt the whole world needs to know about this. So this is the beginning of my concern and my passion for growth. So later on then, as I went in particular into the scientific field, and as each instance of a scientific principle would come forth, I said, this can provide insight to the growth of Baha'i Faith. And so I had accumulated many of these metaphors. Suddenly it made sense to me why we were not growing like wildfire, and what could possibly be an explanation. And so I set out in writing this book. This is actually what the book is about. There are 10 chapters in it, and it discusses the nature of growth, what are those factors from within the Baha'i community that can impact growth, what are those factors outside the Baha'i community on which we have no control, but can enhance to 1,000-fold our growth, the growth of Baha'i Faith under the plans to the present day, and the process of crystallization of the Baha'i community. So there are 10 chapters in this book, and they all center on certain metaphors, mostly from science, but also from philosophy of history and philosophy of science to somehow elucidate this process of growth. And as it did for me elucidate, I thought perhaps I should put it in form of a book. But then the challenge became, as I have discussed in the preface of this book, that I have to explain to the reader the how and the what and the if of this involvement. I have to explain why I'm talking about the growth of the Baha'i Faith in such an unconventional manner, because to my knowledge, it has never been done before. To talk about scientific metaphors and take them and apply them to the Baha'i writings. And then I convinced myself that Abdul Baha has encouraged us to use metaphors from nature, from science, to spiritual matters.
He always did that. He would always say, look at this rose here on the table. And he would talk about the rose and relate it to the faith. Yeah.
Yes. The next challenge was how to elucidate or use these scientific principles for an audience who may be from different disciplines. And that was even a bigger challenge. So I tried to do that, to explain it with clarity and revise and revise and revise. So finally, with clarity, but however, without compromise of accuracy.
So it is a book that someone who is not an academic could read and appreciate.
Yes. I'm sure that all Baha'is, because the readership will be mostly Baha'i because of the title of the book, I'm sure that most Baha'is can, without a doubt, get it and get even more. But to present it to, let's say, someone who may be in other areas, other fields, and explain the scientific principles, such as, for example, the laser beam in the second chapter, chapter 2, how to explain that with utmost clarity, or how to explain cell division, mitosis, with utmost clarity, and relate it to the growth of Baha'i Faith, or to how to express the nervous connection, that nervous reflex, to the growth of Baha'i Faith. As I'm saying these things, you're probably wondering, my gosh, these do not relate, but they really do relate. Each of these examples.
I'm sure. Would it be possible for you to give us briefly a glimpse into just one of them?
Yes.
One of the metaphors that you used?
Sure. Let me go to the cell division.
Yes.
Mitosis. The cells within the body are of different sorts. Some of them remain dormant for many years, and then all of a sudden, under a certain influence of a hormone, they start to divide. And for example, our germ cells are like that. Our gametes are like that. And some cells divide routinely they have a cycle. And let's take as an example a cell in the body which has a cycle of 24 hours.
Yes.
That is, it takes 24 hours for it to duplicate. One cell becomes two daughter cells. Now, if we look at the life cycle of this cell, we see that all of a sudden it's only 1 hour of the 24 hours that the cell divides into two. The other 23 hours, when you look at the cell, it seems to be dormant, as if nothing is happening. But that in reality is not the case. If we use biochemical assays, we can show that in those 23 hours, which has 3 phases in its cells, a lot is happening. Actually, all of the resources of the cells, all its proteins, its organelles, its carbohydrates, its lipids, it's multiplied by 2.
They're preparing.
Yeah, but you don't see it. It is only in that 1 hour when the cell divides that you see 2 cells. So the point being that there is a period where the growth is not visible. But it's a preparation, it's a building up of resource for that 1 hour when the cell becomes 2. So this can easily be applied to the growth of Baha'i Faith, because what in particular at these times when the questions do come up, we are not growing what is happening, but we are building up resources. We are building up resources with all of the plans, with plans directed by the Universal House of Justice, in anticipation for the right time to become 2. And furthermore, in the 3 phases of interface, where apparently nothing is happening. Also, there's a lot of monitoring of growth to see whether the cell should proceed. Has it reached a certain level that it should proceed? And there's a lot of monitoring of. So I think it beautifully applies to our situation, our growth of the Baha'i Faith. I don't know if this is making sense to you.
Yes, it reminds me, one of the things Baha'is are asked to do is to read the writings every morning and every evening. and not to just read as in mechanically reading the words on the page, but to read them with a deep feeling of understanding, trying to understand what it is and to grow from that. That's such a simple thing, but to me, that's like a preparation that you need to have. And when you don't have it and don't have that kind of preparation for when you're going out to do the active service now in the field, then it's not going to have the same effect.
Yes, exactly. And at another level, all of the activities that are now underway, the study circles, devotional meetings, children's classes, junior youth empowerment programs, and whatever other activity will be added, that is all building up of resources.
Yes.
You see, which we don't actually see yet in numbers, or I don't see it in numbers. If you go after the numbers, how many have? So it's all that preparation for that division.
It makes a lot of sense.
So there are many other metaphors. Each one of them provides its own insight. Do you like me to go to laser beam?
Yes, please. Why not?
Okay. I have used the metaphor of laser beam for action, growth of Baha'i Faith for action, and empowerment to act. The laser beam, light that we talk about has a spectrum of wavelengths. By itself, it doesn't have that much power. But if you take this light, which is composed of many wavelengths, and under optimal conditions, connect it to a source of energy, under optimal conditions with the appropriate equipment, what happens is you can generate a laser beam. And you can generate a laser beam of such strength that can carry out very specific functions, even welding of metals, even surgery. So I have used this metaphor to say that if we connect to the source of our faith, to Baha'u'llah, his writings, to the covenant, that light, which is now of different spectrums, is diffused and be generated into very strong light of wavelength, which has coherence. And that, in fact, is fascinating that once over half of the population falls into that particular level of the beam, then a very strong beam is generated. But it really doesn't matter with the other that doesn't, because the crest of one cancels the trough of the other. And so the lesson is, if we connect to the source of our faith, a laser beam can be generated that is strong and able to carry out its function, which in this case that I'm talking about is the growth of the Baha'i Faith.
You mentioned the principle of coherence. So in the faith, that would be sort of analogous to unity. Everyone working in unity for the same purpose and cause and focusing. Yes. Very, very interesting.
Thank you. So this book has many delicious metaphors.
I look forward to reading it.
Writing this book, what it has done for me, right from just completing this writing project, has been that my devotion to the House of Justice has been strengthened. Strengthened is not the word, because the devotion has been there, but it has really, you give me the right word for this.
I can think about it. I'll probably dream about it and tell you tomorrow.
Okay. Strengthened means that it was weak before, but it wasn't.
Yes.
Kind of all of a sudden gelled, I don't know. Anyway, something like that. He provides, as children, he provided an example. And with this also my mother. She was his companion throughout life. And she was very strong in the faith. And in this video also, there's a portion where it says, when my father married my mother, he was a quite well-to-do businessman. He told her, there's nothing I expect from you. I don't expect you to cook. I have help for all of that. What I expect you to do is to love the faith, devoted to Sharia Fendi as much as I am. And she said, I will try. So she became that in her life. As children, I remember both of them being so strong. I remember our fast. We would get up in the morning. This was the setting in Iran. We'd get up early. The breakfast would be prepared, and the samovar would be on the side preparing the tea. But before that, we would have our prayers together. And the voice of my father, he had a very, very strong voice that came out with passion, reading from the writings. And there's one particular prayers for the fast. I beseech thee, and it has its refrain on and on and on. Don't know if you're familiar with it. There's a refrain that comes after every segment. So he would chant that, and when we would get to this refrain, we were all to say it in unison. It made the fast very special. So my belief is that I really am convinced, because of not only my own experience, but once the Baha'i Faith, the strength, is inculcated in a child, then it will never leave them. Because the myelination of our nerves, of our axons, does not complete until some years after birth. And it is then that our personality forms. So if we miss that period, early period, we have missed a lot.
Right.
I'm not saying it cannot be recouped. I'm not saying that. But there's something that happens. Because even in this day, some Baha'is of my generation, I mean, were not particularly devoted. I mean, they would say that. When it came to the persecution of Baha'is in Iran, all those memories of their childhood sustained them. And they became as giants. So the education of children, early education of children, not only the book reading, but also providing that conviction, is very important.